Hey guys, tonight we descend into the decadent underbelly of medieval royalty, the kind of place you stumble into by accident and instantly regret. You're about to tiptoe through candlelit corridors where silk whispers, power intoxicates, and perversion masquerades as policy. You probably won't survive this one without raising an eyebrow, or 10. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your current location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where we're all winding down together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into a lavish chamber, not of gold, but of velvet shadows and hushed rumors. The year is somewhere in the tangled folds of the 1200s, and you, dear listener, have just creaked open the heavy wooden door to royalty at its darkest. You blink through perfumed haze and squint at a banquet not of food, but of carefully curated sin. Welcome to a world where king doesn't mean protector, it means proprietor of whims. Where laws bend not to justice, but to libido. You're standing beside the throne now, noticing how it's cushioned not for comfort, but for ceremony. Its carvings aren't of noble beasts, but of writhing figures that would make a monk cross himself twice. From here, you begin to understand. Medieval courts weren't just political battlegrounds, they were theaters of desire. And more often than not, the show was private, except for you. It starts with whisper networks. Courtiers speak of rulers who collect confessions not for redemption, but for entertainment. You overhear a tale of one monarch whose clerics were instructed to report not sins, but fantasies. That's right. Instead of absolution, they received invitation. You peer around at the ladies-in-waiting, each trained not just in etiquette, but in role-play and musical seduction. They're actors in a royal opera conducted behind velvet partitions. And while mainstream history gives you treaties and battles, the footnotes, those glorious footnotes, reveal that diplomacy sometimes started in bed. A splash of wine lands near your feet. You follow the ripple back to a chalice held by a sly-eyed noble who winks and mouths, "Welcome to Versailles." Wrong century, sure, but sentimentally accurate. Tonight's perversions aren't always physical. Some kings preferred psychological play. You're handed a scroll written entirely in riddles, half political cipher, half erotic limerick. Historians still argue whether this particular king invented double entendre or merely weaponized it. In one corner, you find a throne room repurposed as a game hall, not for chess, but for intimate dares. Think truth or dare, but the stakes include land titles and arranged marriages. One famous anecdote involves a ruler who challenged guests to enact scenes from mythological tragedies, except every performance ended in scandal, not sorrow. And you? You inch closer to a tapestry depicting a hunt, but the prey isn't a stag, it's a virgin. The metaphor stretches unpleasantly thin. One fringe tidbit you'll never forget. Some kings commissioned artists to hide erotic scenes within battle tapestries, a concept called visual misdirection. Scholars still debate whether it was subliminal messaging or just juvenile amusement. Let's talk symbolism. That crown glistening under torchlight isn't just gold, it's flanked by serpents. Not the biblical kind either. These serpents are stylized as lovers in mid-coil. Historians squirm over this. Was it artistic license or a bold announcement of the king's proclivities? You pause under a stained glass window and spot something curious. Embedded near the bottom, hidden by glare, is a tiny depiction of a winged creature with a mischievous grin and swollen cheeks. You ask yourself, is that a cherub or something far more suggestive? Some fringe historians argue these images were coded messages between royals, their version of emojis. The air grows thicker. You pass a corridor marked by carved roses, each thorn gilded, each petal unnatural in proportion. It said the ruler who walked here nightly wore perfume designed to mimic petrichor mixed with myrrh, intended to summon melancholy before pleasure. There's no way to confirm this, but the mere idea stays with you. By now, You feel the weight of velvet against your breath, as though centuries of indulgence are pressing on your lungs. You hear music, soft, harp-like, but it's in reverse. Scholars remain torn on this. Did some medieval composers actually write tunes meant to be played backward, creating an unsettling ambiance during secret gatherings? Conspiratorial? Maybe. But the evidence, like the music, lingers uneasily. You turn one last corner and stumble upon a door, carved in concentric circles, each tighter than the last. It doesn't open. It never has. Legend says behind it lies the king's mirror, a chamber built to distort reflections so guests question their own morality before entering the inner sanctum. You touch the handle. It's warm, but not inviting. That's enough for your first night in this gilded madness. You stumble forward, your steps muffled by layered rugs that reek of frankincense and forbidden indulgence. The velvet you passed earlier has morphed into heavier brocade, and the air, curiously, feels thicker, like secrets condensing into mist. Welcome to the realm where crowns aren't just symbols of rule, but keys to unapologetic pleasure. Royalty wasn't just about bloodline, it was about boundaries. How far a man with absolute power could stretch them before morality snapped. The door ahead creaks open without invitation. Inside, a monarch lounges in a bath not of water, but of mulled wine. You're not entirely sure if the steam is from heat or scandal. This is the king who wrote edicts not to govern land, but to structure desire. Historians still argue whether his infamous Royal Knight's decree was a myth or suppressed policy, but the parchment allegedly dictated how every noble guest must contribute one entertainment, and entertainment was broadly defined. You pause by an ornate desk, its drawers filled with sketches, all drawn by royal artists and all unsettlingly precise. Anatomical studies? Not quite. These renderings depict royal fantasies in disturbingly clinical detail. The fringe tidbit here? Some scholars discovered ink formulas unique to these sketches, scented, so the viewing experience was fully immersive. The concept of multi-sensory erotic documentation was centuries ahead of its time. A scribe passes you, muttering about a law altered to forgive an affair deemed too creative to be punished. You tilt your head. That sounds legal adjacent. Turns out, this ruler believed artistry and intimacy were one. If a scandal made the court gasp and blush in poetic cadence, it was effectively declared a cultural celebration. The banquet hall you enter next is surreal. Tables with dishes carved into suggestive shapes, menus written in romantic verse, and a punishment box in the center, not for wrongdoers, but for the uncreative. One confirmed historical fact. A royal advisor was demoted simply for presenting a mundane dessert. That poor soul offered a regular almond cake. The king had it flattened and served under a shoe. Let mediocrity be trampled, he supposedly declared. This ruler also toyed with architecture. You pass rooms shaped like spiral shells, designed to induce vertigo in guests before they emerged into candlelit performances. One staircase leads you downward, while the wall art tells a progressively salacious story. Was it religious penance? No. It was a carnival of temptation, engineered with mathematical precision. You overhear a court musician discussing tuning methods for the Mohn scale, a string tuning system based on tones that mimic human pleasure. The performer insists it was once used to score a royal wedding night. A chamber quartet played behind silken curtains while the newlyweds consummated the union. Historians grimace at this anecdote, some calling it apocryphal, others noting suspicious gaps in music archives. Another whisper reaches your ears, something about a mirrored masquerade. You peek into a gallery of masks, each crafted to reveal as much as it concealed. One mask, designed for the king himself, had lips made of red glass and eyebrows that adjusted via hidden levers. The implication? Roleplay wasn't merely costume, it was engineering. You notice a painting with 3 horses and a woman holding a compass. Symbolic? Probably. but one obscure historian theorized it illustrated the king's belief in triangulating passion with direction, energy, and chaos. Whether the idea was philosophical or just egotistical geometry, you're not sure. Suddenly you find yourself in a room where parchment scrolls hang like laundry. Each scroll details a guest's experience, a kind of Yelp review for royal escapades. Language ranges from poetic to clinical. 4 5 stars. Chamber was humid, but the harpist played until sunrise. You squint. Could these be real? Fringe scholars insist a few copies exist in underground collections, especially in places where library censorship once ran wild. A servant enters, rolling a cart of perfumes, but none smell floral. They're based on sensations, longing, confusion, satisfaction. And you're offered one called delayed gratification. It makes your skin tingle but your nose rebel. By now, you've heard 3 different versions of a scandal involving twin dancers, a rotating stage, and a blindfolded magistrate. Which one is true? Historians still argue whether the magistrate was duped, delighted, or both. The surviving record only says he retired with a smile and a limp. This king, this sovereign of seduction, wasn't content with power over land. He wanted dominion over emotional response, sensory reaction, and psychological tilt. Every guest was a pawn in a sensual chessboard where unpredictability won more favor than loyalty. And now, as you step into the final chamber, you notice the throne again, but it's mirrored now. Your reflection stares back, slightly warped, slightly amused. Are you the observer or the participant? In this court, consent was theatrical, spectacle was law, and the line between ruler and subject blurred beneath soft candlelight. You blink once more. The room dissolves into velvet shadows again. You step gingerly onto polished marble floors slick with spilled secrets. This court feels quieter than the last, but the silence is curated, a hush wrapped around pleasure, like velvet stretched over steel. You've arrived in the salons of Paris, late medieval era, and the king here doesn't simply indulge. He choreographs depravity like an opera director with a taste for the absurd. The scent of orange blossom and something faintly metallic fills your lungs. Gilded mirrors line every wall, but none show you truthfully. They're angled, beveled, layered to distort perspective and identity, exactly as the king preferred. Historians still argue whether his obsession with altered reflections was political theater or a symptom of psychological disarray. Either way, you find yourself blinking in disorientation. This monarch, often dubbed the Prince of Pleasure behind closed doors, held masquerade balls so lavish, even the Pope sent letters asking whether they were acts of tribute or acts of temptation. You pass beneath a crystal chandelier where the candles flicker just a shade too blue. A servant explains the king had custom-tinted wax, designed to make everything feel like moonlight, regardless of the hour. This was his eternal twilight aesthetic. One confirmed historical fact. He introduced a court decree mandating masks at all nighttime gatherings. The reason? Anonymity bred honesty, or rather indulgence. His advisors protested the confusion it created in matters of diplomacy, but he waved them off with a toast. Let names vanish. Let desire remain. You pause beside a portrait. It's of a woman whose gown shifts depending on where you stand. Low neckline from one side, modest shawl from another. A fringe tidbit? This was one of the first royal commissions using lenticular illusion, centuries before the effect became common. The painting reportedly hung above his decision chair, where he'd choose evening partners based on optical amusement. The king's diary, well, the one historians were allowed to read, mentions a concept he called compulsory uninhibition. You're handed a translated excerpt. To truly know my kingdom, I must see it unmasked, emotionally, sartorially, sexually. Some scholars insist this was metaphor. Others say it was literal policy. Either way, you begin to understand why courtiers whispered with awe and unease. Tonight's entertainment? You wander into a performance chamber where actors repeat historical tragedies, but each role ends with unhinged improv. One show, preserved in records, reenacted the fall of Troy. But Helen's escape was paused for a seductive monologue that lasted 45 minutes. You imagine the faces of the ambassadors in attendance, poker-faced, probably not by choice. In this salon, music is forbidden unless played backwards or blindfolded. You witness one trio, mandolin, lute, harp, fumble for harmony while a jester flirts with an audience member via puppets dressed as philosophers. The absurdity isn't accidental. The king believed chaos eroded inhibition. He even renamed his guards disruptors, trained to randomly tickle, interrupt, or seduce guests mid-politics. You inspect a menu of the evening's rituals. One reads sensory roulette, where guests pick a velvet pouch, and whatever's inside dictates their next activity. Dance, declaim poetry, remove one garment, or confess a forbidden thought. The roulette wheel spins now. You watch a baron draw confess. He leans toward a tapestry and murmurs, "I envy swans." Nobody blinks. Candle smoke twirls as you're led into a smaller chamber, a place historians dubbed the Cabinet of Echoes. It's acoustically designed so whispers bounce 4 times before fading. The king often paced here, muttering fantasies, listening to their repeated decay like a soundtrack of longing. One quirky detail, the walls were embroidered with names of past lovers, but never in full, just vowels. So intimacy became puzzle. You catch a glimpse of what might be the royal bed. Its frame, carved from one single trunk of cherry wood. Legend claims it once served as a confession booth before being repurposed. The mattress is layered with feathers from swans, peacocks, and doves, a symbolism cocktail no historian can confidently decode. Some say purity, others, vanity. A few, just comfort. A marble column nearby features Latin script that loosely translates as, "What pleases the eye, pleases the heart. What pleases the heart needs permission only from moonlight." Was it the king's motto? Scholars debate. You just nod, slightly seduced. You exit through a hallway of mirrors, each carved with a single question. Who are you without title? A rhetorical nudge or psychological trap? Either way, you've made it through the salon of illusions. But something about your reflection feels different now. You duck beneath a thick hanging tapestry as laughter drifts through stone corridors. The sound is familiar, comforting even. But the source? It's not joy. It's the kind of laughter that echoes off secrets, bruised egos, and heavy doors. You've slipped into the side chambers of Henry VIII's court, a place usually defined by wives and beheadings. But tonight, you're peeling back the layers that don't make it into textbooks. The first thing you notice? There's velvet here too. Yes, but it's torn in places, as if clawed in frustration. Candles burn low, but not for ambiance. They're positioned specifically so shadows fall across portraits in strange ways. One confirmed fact from the archives. Henry commissioned at least 2 paintings where the subjects appear to watch you no matter where you stand. Was it paranoia? Or a metaphor for ever-present judgment? You're guided toward a room rarely mentioned in documents, what one fringe historian called the vault of non-marital affairs. It sounds clinical, almost mundane, but inside, you find a rotating set of guest lists, coded in florid Latin, using fruit metaphors. Apple denoted intrigue. Fig implied the subject might talk. Pomegranate, you don't want to know. A servant slips by, trailing scent of rose water and sweat. You follow. There, pressed against the wall, is a faded mural of Venus and Mars. But Mars looks distinctly like Henry himself, belly and all. The mural's eyes move. Not literally, of course, but the paint has oxidized so curiously over time that they shimmer under torchlight. Some say it was deliberate, a psychological trick. Scholars still argue whether Henry himself asked for such unsettling embellishments, or if court artists quietly mirrored the king's growing mania. You glance around and notice something odd. All chairs in this room face each other directly, with no escape paths. Why? Because this wasn't a gathering space. It was a verbal jousting ring for romantic declaration and honor play. One particularly strange tradition involved wooing contests judged by scribes. If you lost, you'd be tasked with serving as the next day's dinner entertainment. Guitars optional, humiliation inevitable. Tonight's ritual? The crownless waltz. You witness two courtiers glide across a checkered floor in slow spirals, while the king watches stone-faced. The rule: neither dancer may hold status above the other. But status was fluid, and the stakes, very real. One confirmed story from court chronicles claims a low-born musician once earned temporary nobility for his performance, only to have it revoked the next morning when Henry decided the man's shoes were too cheerful. You edge through a narrow hallway lined with etched wooden panels. Each panel contains a secret confession by former wives, written in invisible ink. Scholars discovered remnants during restoration attempts, noting phrases like, "he wept, then laughed, then wept again." One debated phrase simply reads, "He asked about my dreams and then told me his dreams were louder." What does that even mean? On the far end is the sapphire niche, a room bathed in pale blue. Legend says it's where Henry practiced speeches designed to seduce ambassadors, not romantically, just diplomatically. Except he wrote them like love letters. One preserved speech begins, "To Spain, whose temperament flirts with tempest." You feel heat rise in your cheeks just reading it. You step into a room with no ceiling. The stars peer down like judgmental ancestors. Here, Henry would host night trials, not legal ones, but emotional. Guests were asked to state one regret. If he liked your answer, you were excused. If he didn't, you had to sleep in the confessor's nook, a chamber with walls that echoed everything you said 3 times louder. An early form of psychological punishment or therapeutic innovation? Historians still debate that one. In the corner stands a mannequin, dressed in royal garb, wearing a mask styled like Henry's younger face. It's said he used it for role reversal games, pretending to be his own servant while assigning tasks to this silent double. One fringe tidbit: the mannequin's lips are made of thin bronze, cool to the touch, allegedly kissed nightly by certain guests. You glance down and notice that the floor subtly slopes. It guides everyone toward a central chair, surrounded by rose carvings that, on closer inspection, aren't roses. They're tiny, curled figures in agony. Symbolism or sick joke? No one's quite sure. And now, before you leave, you're offered a goblet shaped like a lion's paw. Its wine tastes metallic and sweet, unnervingly intimate. As you sip, you realize this court wasn't about lust. It was about control wrapped in ritual. Pleasure choreographed around dominance. And Henry, with all his infamous indulgences, didn't just want affection. He wanted theatrical surrender. You set the goblet down, and you back away slowly. Because here, desire wore armor. You now enter a court that feels colder, more austere. The hallways are lined not with gold or velvet, but harsh stone etched with biblical verses, each modified just slightly. Welcome to the Spanish cloak of shame, where desire was punished by ritual and guilt was worn as regalia. The ruler who walks these corridors, whispers call him El Silencio, was famous for his paranoia. But what they don't always tell you is how deeply that paranoia was tied to personal temptation. He didn't trust his own mind, so he turned his anxieties into policy. Historians still argue whether his infamous oath of reflection was sincere piety or strategic performance art. The text required all court members to confess temptations, even unacted ones, once per week. You hear echoes of those confessions now, some murmured through ventilation tunnels, some etched into furniture. The first room you enter reeks of incense, not for ambiance, but for fumigation. Desire, the court believed, was contagious. One confirmed fact: this king funded alchemists to create perfumes that inhibit carnal thoughts. None worked, of course, but the court still wore them religiously. You're offered a vial labeled Sombra de Cristo, Shadow of Christ, and you swear it smells like longing and mold. Tonight's ritual is the cloaking. You witness a noble being wrapped in dyed linen until only their eyes show, then instructed to recite childhood sins while pacing a circle. You ask a servant what happens afterward. They shrug. He's allowed to sit nearer to the king, that's all. But proximity here isn't reward. It's a test. You examine the throne, a monstrous thing made not of wood, but melted coins seized from dishonored lords. It's uneven, uncomfortable, and tilted. The fringe tidbit? It was intentionally built so the king never appeared relaxed. The message: pleasure must be earned through shame. You step into a smaller room lined with feathers. Not soft ones. These are sharp, brittle, arranged in patterns that scratch when touched. It's said the king ordered this chamber built to house forbidden thoughts. Courtiers were made to sit here if caught smiling too often. A surviving diary reads, "The smile was involuntary, the punishment choreographed." At the far end of the hallway, you find the confession clock, a bronze timepiece with no hands. Each hour is marked by a different sin, with lust written in larger font. It was used during royal meetings, reportedly as a psychological prompt. Scholars debate if it was clever politics or private obsession. Either way, you feel its influence. Your thoughts stutter, your heartbeat accelerates. You're escorted into a corridor where mirrors hang backward, reflecting nothing but stone. This was the king's tactic against vanity. One confirmed fact: his advisors were forbidden from grooming in public. Beards grew wild, hair fell limp, and court paintings from this era depict nobles looking astonishingly miserable. Fashion was not just discouraged, it was demonized. In the center of the courtyard stands a sculpture of a chained angel, wings clipped, gaze downturned. It's carved from soapstone so soft that rain reshapes it. You're told that's intentional. Each storm symbolically punishes the angel. Symbolism or sadism? Historians still argue. A servant offers you a glass of spiced wine, thick and sour. The recipe? Based on texts from St. Augustine about temperance. It's brewed to cause mild headache and limit unholy cravings. One fringe detail: a few rogue nobles used this wine as an aphrodisiac, sneaking in honey to reverse its effect. They were caught. Public apologies followed. One even had to recite his romantic poem to a horse. Don't ask why. The horse wore a crown. As you tiptoe through the final chamber, you see candles shaped like tears, designed to melt downward and splash onto punishment scrolls placed underneath. The wax blurs ink in patterns the king insisted were divinely inspired. It's nonsense, probably, but it looks eerie enough to believe. In this court, pleasure was feared, cataloged and ritualized, but never truly banished. And as you exit, passing rows of folded cloaks and blistered wood, you realize guilt here wasn't weakness. It was theater. You cross into Hungary now, not through fields or fortress gates, but through the fading echo of masked laughter. The court is already spinning by the time you arrive. Mirrored walls, flickering candlelight, and guests shrouded in velvet disguises. This isn't a simple masquerade. It's a performance without an audience, a blood-tinged game where the king plays host, director, and antagonist. Tonight's indulgence? You're ushered into the Masquerade of Innocence, a twisted royal ritual that mimics childhood games, but with terrifying implications. One confirmed historical fact: this king reinvented old village folk games as court amusements, adding wagers so steep they threatened noble lineages. Duck, Duck, Goose became a race for inheritance. Musical chairs decided who got land titles. Historians still argue whether the king orchestrated these games for satire or sadism. You watch as courtiers shuffle behind mirrored partitions. A woman dressed like an acrobat glides forward, her mask shaped like a fox. She bows before the king, who wears no mask, just a crown made of antlers. That crown, you learn, wasn't decorative. It was carved from trophies of former lovers' family crests, a fringe detail passed down through scandalous poems. In this hall, identity isn't just concealed, it's rewritten. You hear rumors of the king forcing guests to swap roles for the night. A general becomes a jester. A maid wears the commander's sash. If the performance pleased him, they kept the title for a week. If it disappointed, they faced red spectacle, a punishment involving crimson ink, forged letters, and exile to a fake village built solely for humiliation. You're handed a piece of parchment. It reads, "Play your part or become the part played." That sounds ominously poetic. You slip it into your robe. The music begins, not violin or lute, but animal sounds layered with chanting. One eccentric claim from scholars: the court musicians had to train for hours mimicking bird calls to score the king's fantasies, especially those involving themes of nature and innocence. The walls of the masquerade chamber shimmer with mica, chosen because it reflects poorly. Why? So dancers would see flickers of themselves distorted, exaggerating both beauty and guilt. The king believed self-image should always be unstable. You watch a noble woman weep as her reflection stretches unnaturally wide. It's part of the game. A servant ushers you into a smaller room called the Velvet Cell. Here, guests are locked in silence until someone recites a painful memory. You hesitate. One voice finally says, "He made me laugh while my mother wept." No context, but you feel that one. You spot puppets on the table, detailed, painted, lifelike. They're dressed in historical robes and known to reenact scenes from past court scandals. One puppet, bizarrely, represents the king himself. Fringe rumor: he once forced a political rival to debate the puppet for 3 hours while wearing a donkey's crown. The record says the rival won the debate. He still vanished by morning. Now comes the part they don't tell tourists: the game of masks. Each guest receives a numbered mask. One mask has 2 numbers. Whoever gets it becomes the judge, tasked with selecting which pair of guests must stage an impromptu seduction scenario. PG-rated, choreographed like opera, but still deeply unnerving. You're handed a mask. Thankfully, it has only 1 number. You slip into an observation alcove where stained glass tells the story of a fox and a swallow. But the swallow's eyes gleam unnaturally, tiny gems inserted into the glass. A fringe detail? Some historians believe these jewels were stolen from a noble's wedding tiara and embedded by royal decree to mock misplaced devotion. The king finally addresses the room. His voice, honeyed and sharp, instructs guests to drink to rolls, not souls. You're offered a goblet of violet wine, brewed from grapes that grow in soil rumored to be mixed with ceremonial ash. No one questions it. You sip because you must. And as the masquerade intensifies, masks fall, but not physically. You begin to see the performative fear in their eyes. The king watches calmly, occasionally adjusting his crown. You realize this court isn't ruled by lust or chaos, it's ruled by manipulation, play acted to precision. You back away through the mirrored corridor. Your reflection blurs, then sharpens, as if reminding you, in Hungary's blood masquerade, you are never fully yourself, just a character, just a pawn. You're stepping into Persia now, a court drenched not only in opulence, but in obsession, where beauty wasn't admired, it was weaponized. The marble corridors here reflect not light, but ambition. And the king who walks these halls? He's less monarch, more curator of pleasure, of bodies styled like art, of rituals that blur gender, power, and identity. The first thing that hits you is the scent. It's floral, yes, but with something deeper: saffron, musk, and something herbal you can't quite name. This king commissioned perfumers to recreate the aroma of longing, not love, longing. A fringe detail uncovered in a merchant's log. The formula was stored in a scroll sealed with rosewater wax, stamped with a petal, not a crest. You walk past high relief carvings, each featuring swans with human eyes and serpents wearing jewelry. Symbolism here runs wild. Historians still argue whether these motifs were reflections of personal philosophy or covert storytelling. Some believe they mirrored the king's romantic power plays. Others insist they were just artistic indulgence. Tonight's court event is the shifting procession. No one arrives dressed as themselves. You notice nobles cloaked in garments that blend traditionally masculine and feminine elements. One advisor wears a tunic embroidered with verses from the female mystic Rabia, while his beard is braided with silver threads that spell out the king's name. You blink twice to confirm. You're handed a program, written on silk, listing tonight's sequence: whispers, mock marriages, perfume exchange, and finally, the mirror offering. The latter? A court game where each guest must stare into a polished obsidian mirror while describing what they see, not physically, but spiritually. Those who falter are sentenced to speak only in riddles for 3 days. One confirmed record reveals an ambassador from Samarkand who failed, then negotiated trade deals entirely through limericks. Somehow it worked. You enter a tented chamber draped in translucent gauze, lit only by glowstone. The king reclines, not on a throne, but on a glass dais surrounded by dancers whose movements mimic blooming flowers. Androgyny here is an exception. It's doctrine. Fringe notes from a court medic suggest the king favored this fluid presentation, insisting beauty was the echo between poles, not the pole itself. A court poet performs next. Her verses, soft, sharp, echo off water-filled bowls designed to amplify melancholy. One poem describes a body untouched by definition, but scarred by interpretation. You're handed a scroll with the same title. You don't open it. Somehow you already understand. The king nods to a servant, who brings forth the knight's plumage, a ritual garment made of rare feathers, worn by the guest of favor. Tonight, it goes to a historian. They're instructed to recite a romantic story backward. It's hypnotic, maybe symbolic, maybe nonsense. But you can't look away. You notice the throne again, if you can call it that. It's a sculpture shaped like a split chalice, symbolizing duality. Each guest who approaches must choose which side to touch. Will you press against yield or command? A nearby scribe murmurs. You choose neither. They smile. Wise. A hallway leads to what the king calls the Chamber of Questions. No answers allowed. A fringe tidbit unearthed from a ruined manuscript. This chamber was used to test loyalty, not by confession, but by curiosity. Those who asked the wrong questions weren't punished. They were gifted silence. The court's drink flows, an infusion of fig, salt, and marjoram, meant to encourage flirtation, supposedly. You sip, and yes, your thoughts swirl unexpectedly. A noble approaches and asks, if you were unshaped, would you still crave praise? You smile, but don't answer. That's the safest play. Music returns, drums wrapped in silk, flutes that mimic breath, and a harp made from polished animal bone, rumored to sing differently depending on the court's mood. Scholars still argue whether this tuning system was spiritual science or eccentric nonsense. You decide, it's definitely both. The evening ends with the mirror offering. You're invited to gaze in. Your reflection ripples unnaturally, as if the surface were water, not glass. And then you hear it, your voice, but backwards. Somewhere behind you, the king whispers, to be seen is power, but to reflect, that is sovereignty. You back away, uncertain whether you've witnessed beauty or manipulation, or something shaped from both. In Persia's jeweled corridors, perversion doesn't shock, it seduces. You step into Poland now, though step feels too gentle for the jolt that meets you. The cold here isn't weather, it's psychological. This palace doesn't welcome you, it sizes you up. And that candlelight? It's dimmed not for intimacy, but secrecy. Everyone's watching, everyone's pretending not to. You follow muffled footsteps into a narrow gallery. The chandeliers above look ordinary, until you realize they're designed to cast shadows shaped like human eyes on the walls. That's intentional. The king here thrived on discomfort, curated paranoia like a chef plating sorrow. One confirmed fact: he ordered a redesign of his court's architecture so no room offered full privacy. Corners always had a peephole, Historians still debate whether this was political caution or voyeuristic obsession. Tonight's gathering is called the Witness Circle. You enter a chamber where all chairs face inward. Guests speak in turn, not to debate or dine, but to narrate stories of what they've seen, not experienced, seen. Voyeurism became duty here. Court officials were trained to memorize body language, facial expressions, even bedroom sounds. A fringe tidbit uncovered in servant logs. Certain guards wore silk-lined ear trumpets to improve auditory memory. You're handed a scroll detailing the evening's structure. Observe. Refrain. Report. Those are the rules. A noble nearby confesses having watched a duke rearrange fruit provocatively for 20 minutes. The room gasps, not at the act, but at how vividly he describes it. Applause follows. In this palace, surveillance isn't hidden. It's ritualized. You wander into the chamber of mirrors, where glass panels twist reflections so that your gaze bounces into another's eye. The king designed it after his favorite myth, where every truth was seen but never spoken. Some scholars link this to his obsession with symmetry. Others suggest deeper issues. A servant offers you a cup, not wine but observation tea, brewed with ingredients said to clarify intuition. A fringe belief passed down from apothecaries claims it increases empathy while reducing modesty. You drink cautiously. The warmth spreads slowly, unsettlingly. On the wall hangs a tapestry stitched entirely from court anecdotes. One reads, "She danced without touching the floor. He cried into a bowl meant for fruit." Nonsense. Maybe. But here, metaphor is gospel. Every act is open to interpretation, especially the perverse ones. You spot a small stage at the room's center. Guests take turns reenacting moments from the week, not dramatic ones, mundane ones. The king believed subtle discomfort revealed character. One confirmed ritual involved miming a dinner gone wrong, while judges graded the accuracy of someone's chewing gestures. You squirm. Everyone else claps. Next, you're guided into the silent balcony, a place for wordless exchanges. Here, guests gaze at one another while the king watches from above. No masks, no roles, just eyes meeting eyes until someone flinches. A preserved note in royal archives suggests this was the king's way of measuring loyalty. Those who blink first dream too loud. You notice the portraits on the wall, all unfinished. One lacks lips, another pupils. These weren't accidents. The king ordered each artist to halt the painting at the moment they felt emotional discomfort. Fringe scholars propose these were empathy maps, documenting where intimacy disrupted skill. Now comes the crescendo. A guest stands to recite a poem. Not his own, someone else's, overheard in private. The poem is about longing, about a button never sewn. The crowd sighs. The act isn't plagiarism here. It's tribute through surveillance. And the poet, wherever they are, might be listening. You exit through a corridor known as the Whisper Spine, where every step triggers a chime tuned to mimic breath. Not footsteps, breath. The design is intentional. The king believed every movement should echo a presence. And you? You walk slower now, wondering who's behind you, or beside you. In Poland's palace of silent witnesses, desire wasn't performed. It was watched, ritualized, archived. And as you pass under the final archway, lined with curtains embroidered with listening ears, you realize, here, privacy was not a right. It was a seduction. You don't walk into the Mongol court. You charge. The wind here doesn't whisper, it snaps. And the tent you enter doesn't shelter. It tests. Welcome to the land of the mirage, where conquest met ritual, and even pleasure was forged like armor. This isn't the world of Genghis Khan precisely. It's the shadowy fringe of his successors, where power was inherited, but twisted through personal indulgence. You find yourself in a yurt far grander than you imagined. Woven tapestries depict not battles, but rituals. One corner shows a man drinking from a skull. Normal? Maybe. In this context, definitely symbolic. Historians still argue whether these post-conquest ceremonies were cultural purification or fetishistic pageantry. The host king isn't present, not physically. He's represented by a sigil stitched into bearskin, a tiger biting a crescent moon. A fringe tidbit from travel journals claims this emblem signified duality, ferocity bound to desire. You're told the king rarely appeared publicly after sunset, preferring his presence to be felt through tokens, sounds, even scents. Speaking of scent, the air is thick with burning juniper and fermented mare's milk. The latter? Not just a drink, but a ritual lubricant. A confirmed fact. One Mongol ruler demanded that all romantic ceremonies begin with shared bowls of airag, not for bonding, but for symbolic equalization. Everyone began wooing drunk. Apparently, it was tradition. Tonight's ritual is the echo hunt. You're handed a small pouch filled with polished pebbles, each inscribed with Mongol script denoting a verb: to chase, to yield, to beg. You must toss one into a bronze bowl. The resulting sound determines your role in the hunt. You toss yield. A servant nods and points to a seat shaped like a crouching fox. Around you, guests wear hides painted with geometric patterns. One noble's robe spirals toward the center of his chest, a visual metaphor for vulnerability. A fringe historian speculated that Mongol court fashion was designed to simulate psychological undressing. You blink. Yes, that checks out. You hear drums now, not war drums, but rhythmically uncertain. Their beats follow the heart of the host king, allegedly recorded by a court medic during one intense evening of desire. This heartbeat rhythm became music, then law. A confirmed ordinance suggests that a missed beat during court rituals led to forfeiture of livestock. The main spectacle begins. Two dancers, clad in silk, reenact a battle, but the weapons are feathered. The victor plucks a ribbon from the other's hair, ties it to a stag statue, and sips airag. It's ceremony, performance, and coded courtship. You look around. No one laughs. This is sacred. Absurdly sacred. You're offered a scroll detailing Mongol beliefs about dreams. One line stands out. The flame that flickers feeds the writer. You ask what it means. A court historian explains, it's the concept that temporary pleasure sharpens ambition. Scholars still debate whether this was used to justify indulgence or sublimate it. A servant guides you through the circle of repetition, a space where phrases are spoken thrice, each time in a different tone. Assertive, seductive, remorseful. A recorded anecdote claims a Khan once judged a lover's sincerity based solely on voice modulation. If the third tone disappointed him, the affair ended. Immediately. Near a fire pit, you find a game in progress. It's called Bone Truth. Guests hold animal vertebrae and answer personal questions. One fringe tale claims a famous general once confessed a forbidden love while holding a goat bone. The bone was later worn as a necklace by the king himself. Trophy or tribute? No one knows. As the ceremony winds down, the wind outside kicks up dust. That's by design. Dust here represents humility. You're handed a cloth mask with slits angled upward, said to mimic the gaze of a bird hunting. You wear it. You feel different. Not elevated, not diminished. Just noticed. A final ritual. Silent sovereignty. The king's sigil glows faintly as the crowd kneels, not to worship, but to reflect. The idea? Power should feel quiet, heavy. Seduction? That too. It should settle in the ribs, not the hips. You step back through the tent flaps. The air outside is rough, dry, and oddly purifying. Here in the Mongol mirage, indulgence doesn't parade, it prowls. You step into the Holy Roman Empire, expecting marble austerity and droning decrees. What greets you instead is scent, unsettlingly sweet, like incense mixed with something slightly metallic, maybe fermented. The corridor you walk feels designed more for spiritual confusion than clarity. Nothing aligns, pillars curve inward, Candles flicker against frescoes that shimmer just wrong. This is not Rome. This is performance. The emperor here, let's call him the virtuous Liege, ruled not with brute force but staged purity. You see scrolls announcing fasting hours, silent prayer mandates, moral hygiene codes. But they hang next to velvet-bound journals documenting curiosities of the flesh, written in the emperor's own hand. One confirmed fact: he financially supported monasteries that specialized in carnal restraint studies. Monks trained not in celibacy, but in endurance. Scholars still argue whether these institutions were spiritual labs or covert pleasure academies. You're guided into a chamber known as the Hall of Mirrors and Morals. Each mirror here distorts you slightly. Thinner waist, broader shoulders, clearer eyes. But every frame is inscribed with a virtue: patience, kindness, chastity. You pause at chastity. The glass reflects you perfectly. That's unsettling. A servant hands you a cup of pear wine steeped with mint and myrrh. The recipe was reportedly inspired by a clerical cleansing ritual, but the mint hides something stronger. You sip, and it tastes like regret disguised as refreshment. Tonight's ritual is the debate of virtues. Two nobles stand in embroidered robes, quoting scripture while subtly implying past indiscretions. You realize quickly, this isn't theology, it's flirtation. One line stands out: "My sin was silence, but silence too sings." The crowd gasps. The emperor nods, pleased. You're led to a bookcase where only one shelf contains real volumes. The rest, hollow. One fringe tidbit from a former court scribe suggests these false books were part of a game. Guests were instructed to pretend to read and then recite invented passages. Points awarded for sensuality, wrapped in academic tone. In a side alcove lies the throne of withholding. Not sat upon, stood beside. The emperor rarely used it, choosing instead to address his court while pacing. One confirmed detail: he commissioned a special music box to play when he paused, timed to specific breath cycles. It emitted tones of grief and longing, or that's what the court composer claimed. You now enter the scriptorium of reflection, where guests write letters they never intend to send. Most begin with, "Forgive my restraint." A preserved note reads, "I only touched the idea of you." Historians discovered these scrolls stored in wax-sealed jars labeled antechambers of virtue. Their contents? A mix of poetry, regret, and frightening honesty. You glimpse the emperor briefly through gauze drapery. His robes glimmer, but it's not gold. It's threads of spider silk infused with silver. Not for luxury, but for symbolism. One fringe detail: it was believed these robes could sting the wearer into virtue. Unverified, but poetic. Suddenly, chanting begins. Not sacred hymns, but verses from a text called the Manual of Disciplined Eros. You ask who wrote it. The servant smiles. Everyone and no one. That seems to be the mood here: shared guilt, diffused desire. At the center of the main chamber, an altar glows, not for sacrifice, but confession through gesture. One noble bows, lifts their hands in a flower petal curl, and steps back. That's it. But the symbolism? Historians still debate if these gestures were religious or ritualized intimacy. And you're invited to choose one virtue to embody. You pick curiosity. The attendant nods, hands you a ribbon with a silver knot, and asks you to write a wish. You do. And then you burn it. That's the final step. In the Holy Roman Chamber of Illusions, virtue was display, indulgence was experiment, and control? Well, that depended on how convincing you were when you said you had none. You step into the frosted stillness of Scandinavia, where silence isn't empty, it's ceremonial. The palace here doesn't sit in a capital. It hovers on a cliff, surrounded by pine forests that sway like stoic sentinels. Cold isn't a season, it's a mood, engineered into every ritual and breath. You enter through a chamber carved directly into ice, not metaphorical, literal. One confirmed fact: this king demanded an entire wing of his court be sculpted from glacier stone during winter, rebuilt annually. The structure groaned with movement, cracked with temperature shifts, and chilled anyone foolish enough to argue indoors. The ruler here, dubbed the Frost Sovereign, was painfully introverted, almost invisible in diplomatic circles. But within these frozen halls, he staged fantasies of control disguised as poetry. His favorite phrase, embroidered on every servant's collar: "Freeze before flame." Historians still debate whether this was personal philosophy or emotional armor. You're ushered into the chamber of echoing light. Reflections bounce wildly here. Polished obsidian floors multiply guests endlessly. The effect? Dignitaries became haunted by their own movement. One fringe detail: scholars uncovered diagrams suggesting the king requested very specific angles, so visitors always saw themselves blurred near the edges. Symbolism? Of course. Here, clarity was punishment. Tonight's event is the spectacle of stillness. All guests must remain motionless for 7 minutes while icy wind is blown across the room via hidden fans. You stand frozen, literally, as candles flicker against hollowed-out polar bear statues. One noble coughs. He's escorted out silently. Later you find his boots displayed in the Hall of Disgrace. Ouch. You're handed a chalice of fermented cloudberry and birch sap. It tastes like memory and tension. A fringe belief, noted in old Viking texts, claimed this drink unlocked suppressed desire only during moonless nights. You glance out the window. No moon, no turning back. Music in this court is rare. Instead, servants glide across snow-glass floors wearing bells tuned to subsonic frequencies. You hear nothing, but your chest hums. The effect? Emotional dissonance. Guests reportedly cried without knowing why. Confirmed fact: one ambassador from Italy wept for 45 minutes before admitting he missed his grandmother's soup. That soup? Tomato and garlic. No correlation found. Next, you're brought into the spectral ballroom. It glows faintly blue thanks to compressed frost panels lining the walls. Dance begins, but not traditional. Here, guests perform emotional spirals, rotating based on assigned feelings. You're given melancholy. You spin slowly. You feel accurate. A servant leads you to a frozen sculpture of a wolf curled around a candle. You're told it represents loyalty biting warmth. That sounds dramatic. But here, that's average. Fringe scholars believe this king's obsession with symbols stemmed from his mother, who reportedly spoke only in haiku for 5 years during grief. You find a balcony above a frozen lake. Below, dancers move silently across the ice, their footprints etched like calligraphy. One wears feathers, another wears fur. The king watches from a heated glass capsule. That capsule, confirmed from surviving sketches, had no entrance, only an exit to maintain mystique. A ritual called the Whisper Offering begins. Guests breathe onto glass panes and trace a word with fingertips. You write almost. The servant nods and places your pane beside 100 others. Later, you notice your word glistens brighter than most. That means nothing. Or everything. You pass into the Hall of Thaws, where tiny droplets fall from melting ice chandeliers. Each drop lands on parchment sheets below, dissolving words. It's performance poetry, slowly erased. One royal decree once stated, "A truth that withstands melting is a lie." Scholars still argue what that even means. Before you leave, the final ceremony begins. Each guest receives a shard of ice carved into a crude heart shape. You're instructed to hold it until it melts, or you grow numb. Your fingers freeze. You drop it. A servant picks it up and whispers, "You feel. That is enough." In Scandinavia's court of frost and fantasies, seduction wasn't heat. It was entropy. And tonight, you've shivered through sincerity. You step into Byzantium now, not through grand arches or heraldic gates, but through a narrow passage draped in crimson silk. The air is scented with spiced rose and candle smoke. Here, theater and power are twin flames, flickering dangerously close to one another. In this court, manipulation wears makeup, and seduction rehearses its lines. The emperor doesn't sit on a throne, at least not tonight. He reclines behind a curtain of pearls, watching his guests through a thin gauze screen. His presence is intentional, mysterious, half-seen. Historians still argue whether this kind of court staging was meant to elevate mystique or to hide insecurity. Either way, the message is clear. Control in Byzantium is indirect, it's psychological. Tonight's ritual is curtains drawn, a performance of gestures rather than words. You sit in a velvet chair surrounded by amphitheater seating. Guests aren't here to eat or drink, they're here to act. Roles are assigned based on emotional archetypes. You receive a parchment. You are doubt. A servant hands you a lilac sash to wear across your chest. One confirmed fact: the emperor's court developed an acting technique known as emotive rotation. Nobles trained to express the same feeling through 5 separate body movements. A preserved scroll describes guilt via neck tilt, hand clasp, breath pause, eye linger, and foot shuffle. No one was permitted to skip steps. Performance was precision. You observe 2 guests acting a scene called the cleansing of wordless betrayal. It involves no dialogue, just movement and shadow play. One lowers a goblet slowly. The other traces a spiral onto the wall. The scene ends when both collapse into synchronized stillness. A fringe tidbit? Surviving notes indicate this specific sequence was based on a real scandal involving stolen correspondence and a mirror placed incorrectly. You're led to the gallery of interpretations, where paintings change meanings depending on viewer positioning. One portrait appears innocent from afar. Up close, it reveals anguished expressions hidden behind embroidered curtains. This was intentional. The court artist used layered brushwork and mineral-based paints to shift color tones by candlelight. Art was weaponized ambiguity. Music wafts in now, strange, looping, trance-like. A servant explains the melody is built on whisper tempo, beats mimic breath drawn between anxious phrases. You feel your own heartbeat match the rhythm. That's the plan. You take part in silent duets, a ritual where 2 guests stand face to face and match posture changes for 10 minutes. No words. One noble subtly changes hand position. You follow. They lean back slightly. You mirror. This isn't mimicry. It's mirrored vulnerability. Historians still debate whether these duets were intimacy exercises or covert power tests. A masked performer enters next, draped in sequins, wearing a headdress shaped like a broken clock. They move slowly, delicately, then suddenly twist into unnatural angles. You're told this is the hour of uncertainty, a sequence meant to reflect emotional breakdown masked as eloquence. The performer ends with a single blink. That's all. You pass into the scriptorium of erased names. Here, parchment scrolls hang vertically, inked with poems, but the authors are all listed only by initials. One reads, "They kissed the idea, not the mouth." Another, "I became fog to stay close." These scrolls aren't archived. They're replaced weekly, burned during closing ceremonies. A fringe detail confirms court attendants rescued ashes and stored them in sealed clay jars labeled emotional residue. The emperor's shadow appears behind the pearl curtain again. He lifts a small mirror and tilts it toward the crowd. That's how he chooses tonight's echo partner, a role played by the guest whose reflection appears most distorted. That guest? A dancer who bowed to no one during rehearsal. You hear gasps. You're handed a drink now, sour, herbal, with rose essence. It's meant to soften resistance. You sip, your shoulders loosen. Maybe your thoughts do too. It's said this drink was inspired by an early Christian ritual, altered through Persian influence, and rebranded as liquid silence. As the final act nears, you witness curtains drawn culminate in shadow puppetry. But these shadows are cast through silk embroidered with emotional sigils. One scene shows 2 figures touching, but their shadows pass through each other. The symbolism isn't subtle. This is Byzantium, the epicenter of longing choreographed around mystery. You exit slowly, brushing past pearl curtains and layered tapestries. Your reflection in the last polished vase is foggy, but not unfamiliar, and you realize in Byzantium, performance wasn't escape. It was confession. You step into Rome now, but this isn't the Vatican of sacred whispers or Latin litanies. This is behind the velvet curtain, where the Pope's own corridors hum with scandal, and puppet kings shuffle through rituals designed not for governance, but gratification. The hallway you walk is too quiet. Statues line the walls, not of saints, but faceless men crowned with laurels made of gold leaf and serpentine shapes. One confirmed historical fact: at least 2 cardinals maintained private theater troupes for moral instruction, but records show scripts titled The Tempting Shepherdess and Vices at Vespers. Historians still debate if these troupes were educational or erotic distractions. Tonight's spectacle is the procession of pleasure kings. You watch as 5 royally dressed guests march in formation, holding scrolls that announce their false titles: King of Echoes, Sultan of Sentiment, Emperor of Absence, and so on. These aren't jesters, they're political puppets, positioned by the church to distract, entice, or entertain elite guests, too important for sermons, but too dangerous for honesty. A servant whispers, "His Holiness plays chess with hearts." You glance toward a map of Europe embroidered with strings connecting cities to portraits. Some strings end in knots. Fringe detail? A surviving ledger shows certain cardinals tracked romantic rumors the way generals tracked troop movement. You're led to the antechamber of indulgence, where gold coins melt in warm bowls, symbols of sins willingly surrendered. Each guest tosses one in and murmurs a desire. You hear everything from a quiet morning to a bishop's silence. A preserved papal note reads, "If God cannot hear our secrets, let Rome archive them instead." Was it satire or confession? Next, you witness the perfume debate. 2 men dressed in papal robes speak not theology, but longing. One says, "The velvet confesses more than parchment ever dared." The other replies, "And incense hides nothing but guilt in disguise." Applause follows. No notes are taken, no proclamations made, only nods exchanged in solemn euphoria. Wine flows, but it's tinted rose, not from grapes, but from crushed petals said to bloom only on former papal hunting grounds. You ask why? The answer? To drink the regret of holy ground. Fringe sources claim one pope once blessed a vineyard, only to use its harvest for seduction rituals. In a side alcove, there's a portrait of a man wearing only a scroll around his waist. The scroll reads, "King by suggestion, pawn by practice." Historians can't confirm his identity, but the portrait hangs next to a locked cabinet labeled Guests of the Veil. The key? Held only by the Archivist of Desires, a position long erased from official records. Now comes the Whisper Communion. Each guest approaches a confessional booth, not to speak, but to listen. Inside, a masked priest recites poetry written by someone else's sin. You lean in and hear, "I prayed for famine so she'd stay." It hits hard. You step back, uneasy. You're handed a silver coin inscribed with a crowned dove pierced by a feather. It's a token of emotional loyalty, something given freely, revoked silently. One fringe scholar claims these tokens were used to rate non-sexual intimacy among royals, how well they feigned restraint. You pocket yours. In the final chamber, red drapes hang from candelabras shaped like open books. One is titled, Psalm of Pleasures Deferred. Each page glows faintly. You ask if they're illuminated manuscripts. "No," says the scribe. "They're scripted dreams from monarchs who forgot how to rule." You glimpse the Pope, only briefly. His ring sparkles, but it's not worn on a finger. It dangles from his sleeve, where it catches candlelight but never commits to skin. That detail alone says everything. As you exit, you pass through a corridor named the Hall of Dissonance, where chants from 3 different religious texts overlap in unsettling harmony. One guest clutches their head, another hums along. You just breathe slowly. In Rome's court of holy intrigue, kings weren't born, they were choreographed. And tonight, the divine wore desire. You're stepping into dusk now, not metaphorically, but literally. The chandeliers flicker lower. The fabrics hang heavier. The throne room ahead has lost its gleam, stained by whispers. You've arrived at the twilight phase of a monarch's reign, when indulgence, once charming and operatic, has begun to rot. This king was once adored, his perversions celebrated as theatrical genius. But tonight, the crowd gathers with narrowed eyes and clenched jaws. The ritual is no longer a game. It's maintenance. You walk across floors worn not by time, but by retreat. One confirmed fact: his court once repurposed banquet halls into observation chambers, where guests pretended interest while secretly gauging when they could leave. The event of the night? The spiral descent, a performance based not on beauty, but on ruin. You're handed a scroll that reads, "Walk your own exit, dance your own apology." Guests spin slowly in circles while confessing 3 regrets. No applause follows, no comfort offered, just silence. The music sounds off, intentional. A fringe detail from court records reveals the king insisted instruments be detuned slightly during his final years, claiming beauty should weep at the edges. You hear that now, a melody that feels almost pretty, then abruptly isn't. The king enters, or rather, is wheeled in, cloaked in silver lace, expression vacant. It's said he no longer speaks directly, only through gestures taught to attendants who interpret them like sacred semaphore. Tonight, he raises 3 fingers. That means, begin sorrow. You follow the crowd into the Gallery of Disillusion, where tapestries depict past triumphs, but have been embroidered over with threads of dissent. One banner once showed a victorious battle. Now, it shows scorched earth and empty tents. Historians still argue whether these edits were ordered by the monarch himself, or by subversive artists emboldened by the failing regime. In a corner alcove, nobles gather around a glass box containing dried roses. Each rose was once gifted during his legendary Masquerade of Echoes. Now they're brittle, colorless. The crowd mutters, "They used to smell like storytelling." A fringe poet long forgotten whispers, "Now they just smell like hindsight." You're invited into the Hall of Undoing, a chamber lined with mirrored tiles, but none show your reflection. Instead, they show you as other guests saw you. Exaggerated, cruel, sometimes cartoonish. The king built this room to humble vanity. Now, it magnifies paranoia. A guest stares too long. They're escorted away. A servant offers you wine, but this cup is different, half empty, always served that way. To symbolize restraint, they say, but you suspect it just saves resources. The fringe rumor? The royal cellar's been half empty for months, entire shelves filled with fake bottles wrapped in gossip. You now witness the pantheon of failed promises. Statues line the walls, each labeled with decrees that never came true. Peace in winter, mercy in tax, love in silence. The irony? They're carved in the finest marble, polished to seductive gleam. Scholars debate whether these monuments were satire or self-punishment. The king speaks, once, suddenly, audibly, "Let memory paint my sins." The crowd gasps. He's not spoken aloud in years. That line becomes the evening's refrain. Guests recite it like a mantra. Some cry, some walk away. One removes their jeweled mask and crushes it beneath a heel. In the final act, you're led to the threshold of absence, where an ornate archway gleams but leads to nowhere. It's decorative, pointless, symbolic. A fringe detail found in old plans reveals the arch was supposed to open into a garden, but the project failed. Budget cut. Flowers died. Birds left. You step back slowly. The room dims further. The king's chair begins to turn. Slowly, endlessly. Like he's facing something no one else can see. Maybe history. Maybe regret. In the twilight of the twisted, perversion doesn't entertain. It exhausts. You walk into legacy now, not as a guest, but as a reluctant heir. The final chord on your journey feels hollowed, not empty, There's weight in the silence. This is the closing chapter, where lust is no longer wild, but archived. Where perversion doesn't scandalize, it stains. This king ruled long, ruled indulgently, and ruled alone at the end. The corridors echo his name not out of reverence, but habit. The tapestries hang too low, the perfume clings too thick. It's not elegance anymore, it's residue. Tonight's final ritual is the thread of retrospection. Guests gather, not for spectacle, but for storytelling. But the tales are filtered through scripts, each version approved by aging advisors. One confirmed fact: the royal archivist created 3 editions of every scandal. One for gossip, one for morality, and one for posterity. No two matched. You're handed a scroll titled Whispers of the Reign. Inside, a timeline of indulgences converted into charitable programs. The pleasure parade became the festival of reflection. The masquerade of heat was rewritten as the winter ball of joy. Historians still argue whether these revisions were strategic rebranding or desperate redemption. A servant leads you into the Echo Library, where walls murmur fragments of past events, gathered from diaries, overheard conversations, even pillow talk. Each sound loops softly, endlessly. You hear, "He laughed at honesty. She forgave nothing. The mask was worn too long." These aren't quotes, they're fingerprints. You find a mirror etched with names, all faded but one. Yours. You blink. A fringe feature of this court's final decade. Visitors were ceremonially added to history by anonymous decree. You don't know who chose you, but now you're part of it. The final performance begins. The monarch's reflection. A single actor dressed in a robe of stitched scandals recites excerpts from the king's private journals. One reads, "Pleasure was my flag, but memory is the wind." The crowd doesn't react. Reaction died here years ago. A cup of inheritance wine is offered, thick, sweet, haunting, said to contain trace drops from every royal toast over the reign. You sip and feel warmth, regret, exhaustion. Guests leave slowly. No one rushes, but no one lingers. You're led to the final threshold, the archive of absence. It contains replicas of past rooms, reconstructed in ice, firelight, paper, sound. Each one feels familiar, but wrong. And at the center stands a throne, not gold, not velvet, just wood, uncarved, undecorated, waiting. You're led to the final threshold, the archive of absence. It contains replicas of past rooms, reconstructed in ice, firelight, paper, sound. Each one feels familiar, but wrong. And at the center stands a throne, not gold, not velvet, just wood, uncarved, undecorated, waiting. You don't sit, you walk away. In this final court, legacy isn't proud, it's complex. And desire, once theatrical, becomes memory with edges. You're tired now, aren't you? Not just from the journey, but from the weight of watching centuries spiral downward. The silk, the shadows, the laughter echoing off marble now fade. Not erased, just gently tucked behind you. Your breathing slows as you pass beneath a final archway stitched with silence. These monarchs, twisted, cunning, brilliant, don't haunt. They linger, like perfume in a chamber that's just been emptied. You feel the chill in places you didn't expect, behind the ribs, between the thoughts. The flicker of torchlight softens now. Each flame bows low, stretching shadows longer until they slip under the doors, past the velvet ropes, and settle into stillness. You close your eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to rest inside what you've witnessed. These stories weren't just history. They were portraits painted with obsession, stitched with longing, and framed with consequence. And through them all, you walked, eyes wide, breath steady. Some truths flickered, some lies smiled, but none of it passed without brushing your skin. The halls behind you dissolve into haze. The masquerades disband, the stained glass dims, and the whispered scripts are folded neatly back into their archives. You're safe here now, just you and the soft hum of whatever you left behind. Let that hum cradle you. Let it rock you gently toward sleep. And as your thoughts drift outward, past Poland's chambers, Persia's mirrors, and the blood-touched silk of Byzantium, remember only this: history was never shy. It simply waited for midnight.